So thank you very much for having me. Yeah, I'm going to talk a bit today about detecting problematic RCTs. Lisa just mentioned that we had a previous talk back in December on zombie RCTs, and I think we're talking about the same thing really. We're just using different terminology. So I'm going to refer to these as not as zombie RCTs, but as problematic RCTs. So before I begin, just my disclosures. So I currently hold or have recently held research grants from these sources. I'm a stats editor at these journals here. I don't think any of this should have any bearing on the content of my talk, however. So before we begin, just want to make it quite clear that in this talk that I'm not accusing anyone of fraud or of any other type of research misconduct. I will say that some trials are unlikely to be authentic or are in some sense untrustworthy. And by that, I mean that the data or the results from these trials do not appear to be compatible with a genuine RCT. But I'm making no claims here that this is due to deliberate action on behalf of the investigators or the authors. So it could be, for example, that there's been some sort of catastrophic errors in the process or in the delivery of the study. Okay. So this talk has two parts. First of all, I'm going to talk about detecting problematic studies in the context of systematic reviews. And in particular, I'm going to introduce you to the Inspect SR project. And in the second part, I'm going to explain or describe a few of the principles that we can use when we are investigating potentially problematic RCTs. So I'll show you just a couple of the kinds of checks or methods that we can sometimes use when we're doing these investigations. Okay, so part one. So we're going to talk about detecting problematic studies in health systematic reviews, and I'm going to tell you about the Inspect SR project. So let's start here. It's probably a familiar story for many of you, but let's start with the story of ivermectin for the treatment of COVID-19. So a couple of systematic reviews were published on this topic, looking at the effect of ivermectin in treating COVID-19, and they both had pretty impressive results. Okay, so they both concluded that ivermectin was pretty effective for reducing mortality in COVID-19. So I've shown the effect estimates on the screen here. They're both pretty impressive. Okay, so that seems like good news, doesn't it? So it sounds like that's great. We've got this effective treatment for COVID-19. And not surprisingly, this received a lot of attention, okay? So these systematic reviews were widely covered on social media and in the media. I've got some quotes here, ivermectin prevents and treats COVID-19. The strength of evidence for ivermectin has this week been supercharged. And these papers were actually used by some sort of anti-vaccination groups, right? So they were able to say, look, we've got this fantastic treatment for COVID-19. We don't need vaccination, okay? It's unnecessary. All seems well and good, but there was a catch, okay? And the catch is that it now appears that several of the trials included in those systematic reviews were not authentic, okay? So what I'm showing you here, this is some analysis by Nick Brown. And this is a spreadsheet purportedly containing the data from one of the studies in these systematic reviews. And Nick has color-coded blocks of data which are just repeated in the spreadsheet, okay? They appear, just blocks of data appearing multiple times in the spreadsheet. So that's clearly not genuine RCT data, all right? And there were several other concerns with this particular study, and indeed there were similar concerns about several of the trials included in these systematic reviews. What did we see if we restricted meta-analyses to trials which were in some sense more credible? Well, let's have a look. So Hill and colleagues, they retracted their systematic review, which is the right thing to do, right? They replaced it with a new analysis, and they said that the significant effect of ivermectin on survival was dependent on the inclusion of studies with a high risk of bias or potential medical fraud. In the new analysis, basically that result there is saying, we don't know, all right? We don't know if ivermectin helps, harms, or does nothing at all. There was another systematic review, a Cochrane review, they were a bit more discerning about the trials that they included. So they stratified their analysis by severity of disease, but in both cases, same thing, uncertain. We don't know if ivermectin helps, harms, or does nothing at all, basically. All right. And the other systematic review I showed you on the first slide, I'm not too sure what's happening with that one, to be honest. It looks like it's got an expression of concern on there, but the link wasn't working when I checked, so I can't give you an update on what's happened with that other systematic review. So is this surprising? Is it surprising that something like this could happen? I mean, I'm not sure that it is. And in fact, it might be inevitable that this sort of thing might happen, okay? So let's think about what happens when we do systematic reviews. So first of all, we attempt to identify all the trials that have been done on the review topic, okay? Regardless of where they've been published, even if they've been published in sort of less reputable journals, we try to identify everything. And that means there's a very high chance that any of these problematic trials will be included. Then we take a look at the studies and we critically appraise their study methodology before including them in a meta-analysis. And we typically do that by assessing the risk of bias in the studies. But those sort of risk of bias assessments are predicated on the assumption that the studies were genuine, that they actually happened as described, okay? We don't normally consider the question of whether or not the trials are authentic as part of that process. And unfortunately, many sort of fake or untrustworthy trials report perfectly sound methods, okay? So risk of bias doesn't indicate any problems whatsoever. Then what do? Well, the systematic reviewers will make conclusions and recommendations on the basis of what they found. And of course, systematic reviews are very influential, right? They're seen as very high quality evidence. They're included in guidelines. They may influence patient care. So I think there's a real sort of concern here that systematic reviews might be acting as a pipeline for sort of fake data to influence patient care. And I showed you one example at the start, but this isn't restricted to any one clinical area. It's not an isolated incident. We see examples popping up all over the place. So I've put a few examples on the screen here. So we've got vitamin K for the prevention of fractures. We've got tranexamic acid for the prevention of postpartum hemorrhage. We've got psychological therapies for the management of chronic pain. These are all examples of systematic reviews where it looks like we have concerns about the authenticity of some of the trials in some sense, okay? Now, recognizing that this is potentially quite a big problem, Cochrane have introduced a new policy, okay? So they've got this policy for managing potentially problematic studies available at that link there. And basically what this policy says is do not include studies until serious concerns about trustworthiness have been resolved. But that prompts a few additional questions, I think. So how do we define a problematic study and how can we detect them? All right. And these are basically the questions that we've been funded to address, funded to answer with the Inspect SR project. So we received some funding from the NIHR to undertake this project, and the overall aim is to develop a tool for identifying problematic RCTs in health systematic reviews. How are we going to do that? Well, we've convened a panel of people with expertise or experience in this area. We have created like a really extensive list of methods for detecting problematic studies. We're next going to take this list and apply this big list of items to a large sample of systematic reviews to work out the feasibility of applying the items and the impact this has on review conclusions. And we're also going to enter the items into a Delphi process to see which ones are supported by expert opinion. So I guess we're making a list and checking it twice, okay? I've made that joke about 3 times over the past few weeks, and I think it gets a bit less funny every time. So apologies for that. But then after that, once we've got our draft tool, we're going to prospectively test it in the production and update of new systematic reviews, and we'll gather feedback and try to use that to improve the tool. So we're just finishing this step here. So I'll tell you a little bit more about this. So how have we started off? How have we made this big, long list of methods to consider, to evaluate for inclusion in a tool? Well, we took our initial list from a few different sources. So we took items from a recent scoping review of methods for assessing research misconduct. We took some from a recent qualitative study on this topic. And then we just added other methods that are known to us. Okay, so for example, my experience in this area is conducting investigations, integrity investigations for journals and publishers. So there are methods I use, methods that I was aware of that I've added to this list as well. So we ended up, after some editing, some refinement, with 102 checks or tests on our long list. And what we did is we just implemented this as an online survey of experts, and we just asked quite simply, are we missing anything? Is there anything we need to add to this list for consideration? So just to give you an idea of the kinds of items that we've put on this long list, again, remember these are on an initial long list. We're not saying that these items are good or feasible or anything like that, just examples of items that we're taking forward for consideration. So we have some preliminary classifications and one example of each. So first of all, inspecting results in the paper, and we could ask, are the results substantially divergent from others in the meta-analysis? And I'll take a moment to say something about that one, because that's the kind of thing that might make statisticians at least a little bit nervous, the idea that you might exclude studies on the basis of their results. We might be worried about skewing the meta-analysis or giving the wrong answer, but let me just show you a quick example of the kinds of thing where it might be useful, I suppose. So this was in the Cochrane review I mentioned a few slides ago, psychological therapies for chronic pain. You can see here quite clearly that there's 3 estimates, 3 studies, all from one author, that are clearly discrepant, compared to the others. So there might be some value in using these kinds of checks to raise the alarm, saying we need to look at this a bit more closely. Okay, returning to the list. So inspecting conduct, governance and transparency. We could check, is the recruitment of participants plausible within the stated time frame for the research? Inspecting the research team. Have other studies by the research team been retracted, or do they have expressions of concern? Inspecting text and publication details. Is there any evidence of copied work? And if you have it, if you can get it, inspecting the individual participant data underlying the study. Does the data set contain repeated sequences of baseline values? So the results of this, well, we're currently analysing all the data from this, so not too much to share right yet, but we've had a pretty good response, I think. So we got responses from 71 people with, expertise or experience in this area, from 5 continents. I think we did okay in terms of global reach, but we can certainly try to improve this in subsequent stages of the project, I think. And we had quite a broad array of experience, I guess, as you see in the table on the left. So some of this is quite interesting, I think. So 85% of the respondents had experience of assessing potentially problematic studies as an independent researcher. So they've done that themselves. So clearly like a motivated group, I guess. I think it shows that there's a lot of people who are really motivated and interested in this topic and who really care about removing problematic studies from the literature. So it looks like we've got about 25 pages of comments and suggestions. So there's a lot for us to work through there. That's a good problem to have, I guess. Okay, it's the sort of thing you see and you sort of look at your Gantt chart and go, I hadn't quite banked on that many. But I think it's a good problem to have. And it reassures me that we're being quite comprehensive in the initial sort of list of checks and items that we are considering to take forward for inclusion in the tool. So at this point, I'll just say, if you're interested in this project, we need input, we need collaboration at all stages of the project, really, from all different kinds of stakeholders, and that's not an exhaustive list there. I'm very conscious that, for this tool to be credible, it needs to be very feasible, but it also needs to be backed by a very broad consensus, all right? So we need people to participate in the Delphi study that's coming up. I'm a big believer in many hands making light work. So if you'd be happy to help applying the items on this list to a few systematic reviews, then just contact me. We need people who'd be willing to test the tool in the development of new systematic reviews when we're a bit further along, and to feedback to us how they found that experience. So basically, if you have any expertise, experience, or even just interest in this area, then you can contact me on my email or my Twitter, and I'll show those again at the end of the talk. But you might be thinking, well, that sounds like there's a lot of work to do. It sounds like it's quite a long way off, and you're right. That is still some way off. There's a lot of work to be done there. So I'd like to highlight some tools or frameworks that are available now or will be available soon. So these are all suggestions for, collections of tests that can be performed in the context of a systematic review, or even outside of a systematic review. Okay, and those are available for you to consider now. I'll also mention a couple of projects that are in development that I'm aware of, that will be with us soon, I believe. So there's some work from the Next Gen Evidence Synthesis team at the University of Sydney, and they're interested in looking at studies in the context of individual participant data meta-analysis. So that's a situation where you've got data, the underlying data set from lots of trials on one topic. You've got sort of comparable variables. You're able to put all the data sets from these different studies in a comparable format. What sort of checks can you do on the data in that situation? Okay, so I believe that's under review and should be published quite soon. Another project I'm aware of, which is in development, this is quite interesting. So this is some work by Colby Vorland. And this is like some software that he's developing to try and automate some of the checks that we might do. So as part of these checks, there are proposals to look at the baseline characteristics in a trial. There are various checks we might do on that. So the idea is, with this software, you can upload the PDF. It will identify the baseline table for you and automate some of this analysis. So that would be really valuable, I think, for reducing the time these investigations take. Okay, so that was part one. In part two of this talk, we're going to change topics slightly, and I'm going to describe some of the principles that we might use for investigating potentially problematic RCTs. Okay, but before we go into this section, I need to give you a bit of context, okay, so I don't mislead you. So for this part of the talk, I'm drawing on my experience investigating potentially problematic trials for journals and publishers over the past 4 or 5 years, I'd say. Whenever I do these investigations, there's obviously an agreement of confidentiality, okay? So I'm not going to be talking about particular cases. All of the following examples are illustrative. So they're all inspired by real cases, but I've changed important details or made new data sets which are similar to real cases, all right? So I've fabricated some fabricated data for you today. I want to be clear that when we do these investigations, it involves a very thorough examination of everything, right? So the manuscript, the data, other sources, which could include, the study registration, correspondence with the authors, potentially other papers published by the authors. I don't want to give the wrong impression that it just reduces to some checks on some data, all right? And when we do these things, we're definitely not trying to prove misconduct or even assess misconduct. Our goals are more modest, all right? We're just trying to say, look, we've got these data here. Could these data possibly have arisen from a genuine RCT? Are these compatible with a genuine RCT, all right? And the conclusions that we reach are based on a very sort of holistic assessment of everything. So I'm going to show you a few isolated sort of checks that we could do, but I don't want to give the wrong impression that we do a check, aha, that's it. It's really based on a holistic assessment of a complete investigation is what I would say. And in fact, I'd probably say that the role of statistical testing in these things is probably not as great as people expect, or as I think people expect. Quite often, the cases don't come down to, the requirement for statistical testing. There are clear problems with the data such that they could not possibly be genuine. Now, these investigations take a lot of time. It usually takes me at least, a day's work to analyze a data set and to write up a report on this. And I think quite often that probably is a source of considerable delay in the process. So I know this can be a source of frustration sometimes when people make complaints to journals and an investigation needs to be done. Perhaps it's me, perhaps I'm the delay, or whoever's doing the analysis of this may be the cause of the delay. If a journal contacts me and says, we've got 8 cases for you to look at, okay, I'm happy to do that. I will find the time in my evenings and weekends to do that, but I can't get it to you in the next few days, all right? It's quite a lot of work to do these analyses. And just to be clear, so I'm illustrating some basic general principles, a few basic checks that we might do here. I'm certainly not trying to be comprehensive. I'm not going into technical details, and I'm certainly not intending this as a tutorial in how to do this. Okay, so with all of that out of the way, let's start to think a bit more about the specifics. So these investigations have 2 main stages normally. So there's normally like a first stage where concerns might be raised with a study, and that's usually on the basis of, the published manuscript or a manuscript that's been submitted to a journal and other publicly available information, right? Like the trial registration. So that's stage 1, where there might be some red flags that sort of say, hold on, cause us to say, hold on, we need to look at this in a bit more detail. I just want to be clear, by the way, I picked a random paper to show on the left there. I definitely do not want to imply that there are any concerns with that particular paper, okay? None whatsoever that I'm aware of. And if we do have sufficient concerns at stage 1, then typically that will trigger stage 2, which is like a more detailed investigation. So in stage 2, we're requesting additional documents from the authors, requesting the underlying data set for the study, and then we'll conduct some detailed analysis of that data set. Now, for both of these sort of stages, it's reasonable to say how can we do this efficiently, effectively? And just as an aside, recognizing that there are these 2 stages, we anticipate that we're going to need either 2 versions of the inspect checklist or 2 components to it, perhaps. One that can be applied at stage 1 when we're just looking at the publicly available information, and another component that can be used when you do have access to the underlying data set as well. And let's just remind ourselves what we're trying to do during this investigation. So we want to ensure that fabricated data can't influence patient care, okay, as we've discussed, but we also want to avoid unintentionally removing genuine data from the literature. There could be various negative effects of that. Patients have given their time to be in the study. Investigators have spent time on a study. If we remove genuine data is obviously very valuable as long as it's a reasonable quality. So it's a real shame to throw that away. So we want to get it right, I suppose. So we don't have too much time today. I'm going to focus on this part, some checks that we can do when we do have the underlying data set. And that's partly just because most of my experience is in that area as well. Okay, so let's start to think about some of the principles we might use when we're doing these investigations, all right? So let's think a bit about, first of all, how recruitment and allocation to treatments happens in a trial. So what happens? So first of all, our potential participants present over time, and they're going to have their baseline measurements taken before they're randomized. So we've got people lining up to enter the trial here, and my orange person is having their baseline measurements assessed. And then anyone eligible is going to be sequentially allocated study arms according to a random sequence, okay? So we know this. Let's see what happens. My orange person's got in arm 1, so is my red person. Blue person's got in arm 2. Green person's got in arm 2 as well, okay? So this is just random allocation following measurement of the baseline characteristics. And there are a couple of implications to this. So I think the first one is probably well understood already. So this means that there are no systematic differences between the groups in terms of their baseline characteristics. There will be random differences in the baseline characteristics. That's fine. Our analyses expect that, they can deal with that, but there'll be no systematic differences, all right? But another implication of it is that any patterns in baseline characteristics over time should appear in both groups. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's imagine for a moment that there's some sort of change in the process, okay, which has an impact on our baseline measurements. So that could be, for example, a measurement device has a problem and starts giving unusual readings, or it could be a new investigator joins the trial and starts to systematically target a different type of patient for inclusion, anything like this, all right? So in my figure here, my purple person has been affected in this way. Their baseline measurement has been affected. Well, the point is that this should start to show up in both arms, in people allocated around this time, all right? Due to the nature of randomization, okay? And indeed, we can look for this kind of thing in the data that we have, all right? So let me give you an example of something that is, genuine data. So in this hypothetical example, we have a 3-arm RCT, blue lines divide into the different treatment groups, okay? And then within groups, we're plotting a baseline measurement in the order of randomization, all right? So our 3 study groups, A, B, and C. And as we go along the bottom, our patients are in randomization order within the group. Now, we might notice something that looks a bit odd in group A. Around here, people start to have much larger measurements, okay? Well, is that a cause for concern? Do we think that this means the data aren't genuine? Well, no, probably not, okay? Because whatever the cause of that is, it's apparent in the 2 other groups as well. So it seems to affect, patients randomized around that time to all 3 groups, which is very much what we'd expect to see under randomization if there was some sort of problem like this. Have a look at this one by contrast, all right? So this is an example of a 2-arm RCT. Same as before, a vertical line divides into the 2 groups. We have a baseline measurement plotted in randomization order within the 2 groups, okay? And you can kind of see, well, here in group B, all of a sudden we have these very large values that look very different to the rest of the data, okay? I mean, again, you can imagine that there could be a reason for this, like a baseline measurement gone wrong or something like that. A device has had a problem, but then why can't we see it in this group over here? Okay, we should be able to see it in that group as well. So this doesn't appear to be compatible with a genuine RCT. These kinds of plots can be very useful, just revealing all kinds of problems. So here's some data I've fabricated. Take a moment to look at this. Can you see any problems in the data? I'll give you a few seconds. Okay, well, you may have spotted, and I've just highlighted some of it here, that there are, clearly repeating sequences of values in the data set. So in this example, I've just repeated sequences of sequences of values in the data set. And plots like these can be very effective in just showing you those very quickly. We can also look at outcome variables. So I've talked about baseline variables so far. Outcomes in a trial are a bit different if we think about them, because they are influenced by treatments. So we do expect to see some differences. However, just sort of plotting them against randomization order or even just data set order can still reveal some improbable patterns. So here's an example here, okay? Take a look at it for a second. This is a categorical outcome variable, which can take values of 1, 2, or 3. Again, plotted in randomization order within groups, all right? See anything odd about this one? Well, we just have long runs of values, right? So we have a long run in the data set where everybody has a 1, okay? Nobody has anything else. We have a long run where everybody has the value 2, nobody has anything else, then back down to 1, then up to 3, okay? It's extremely difficult to see how this sort of thing could be compatible with a genuine RCT. It would be consistent with data being fabricated in blocks, all right? So someone's typed a lot of 1s, typed a lot of 2s, etc. Very simple checks, but they can be very effective in revealing problems. Another thing we might consider is whether there is correlation across rows in the data set. So the idea here is that you don't really expect to see substantial correlation between the baseline values of successive participants recruited to the study, all right? So for example, one participant's duration of infertility shouldn't be related to the duration of infertility of the person recruited after them, or to the person recruited after them, or to the next persons, and so on, okay? So, you know, in my example on the right, this is just the first 15 rows, say, from a data set, all right? We shouldn't expect to see any correlation between successive values as we move down the rows. But we do expect to see some sort of correlation across rows if someone has typed, made up values into the column, if they've just sat down and, you know, typed a column of values. And that's because people are quite poor random number generators. So there tends to be these dependencies in subsequent values. You might expect to see a bit of correlation, I suppose, naturally, in successive participants for various reasons. But if there is some sort of correlation across the rows, we certainly don't expect this to differ between the randomized groups for similar reasons to those we've discussed in the last few minutes. So we can look at this, okay, in the data that we have. So we can use, for example, an autocorrelation plot, as I'm showing you here. Here I'm showing you the autocorrelation plot for a treatment group and for a control group. Well, what is this? So what this is basically showing you is it's the plot of correlation between duration of infertility values 1 row apart, 2 rows apart, 3 rows apart, and so on, all right? And you can kind of see in my treatment group, there is a correlation between successive rows, which sort of decays as we get further apart, all right? Quite substantial correlation. But that isn't present in the control group. So the control group, this is basically what we normally expect genuine data to look like. There is no serial correlation between the rows. So what I'd say is, you know, the treatment group correlation is suspicious. And the fact that there's this difference between supposedly randomized groups in terms of this dependency in the baseline measurements is even more so, all right? So we're relying on the comparison between the randomized groups there. Another thing we often look at is the relationships between the variables in the data set. So are the expected relationships between variables present? This can actually be quite hard to fake unless you know what you're doing, okay, to get sort of like the relationships between lots and lots of variables correct. But importantly, it really requires, you know, contextual knowledge. So in this particular study, should we expect a relationship between the gestational age and birth weight, all right? So this might require some domain knowledge, some clinical expertise to be able to answer questions like this. But again, as I've described on previous slides, a really crucial factor is that we don't expect the multivariate distribution, this, you know, all these relationships between all these variables to differ between randomized groups, at least not in terms of the baseline characteristics anyway. Okay, so I'll just make a few closing comments then. I've just shown you a couple of different basic checks that we might do, okay? Just to give you an idea of the kinds of things we might be looking at when we're doing these investigations. But, you know, I've shown a few basic checks there. I'm not saying that's applicable or appropriate for every study. Different approaches may be more or less appropriate for particular cases, for different data types, etc. But a point I want to make is that we really do understand a lot about characteristics of data arising from trials, and we can use that to assess whether the data are basically compatible or incompatible with a genuine trial. Of course, whenever we see anything odd, we always need to think, you know, could there be an explanation for this? And of course, we can ask questions of the authors and maybe they can provide reasonable explanations, all right? In some cases, there is extremely clear evidence of fabrication. So For example, certain cases when we've got these repeating sequences or copied blocks of data, quite often, it's very hard to think how that could have happened innocently, all right? But in other cases, it's really unclear whether we're dealing with misconduct or just extremely poor conduct. Is this just a result of catastrophic data management, for example? I suppose either way, we may have reservations about using that data to decide how patients are treated. And I suppose one final discussion point that I'd be interested to hear people's thoughts about: is it a bad idea for me to give talks such as this? Arguably, I'm showing some of these basic checks that we can do. If you are a fabricator, you can go away, run those checks yourself, and make sure that you pass them. So I'd be interested to hear people's thoughts on that point. So just to close then, so I'll say thanks to all of the expert panel members on the Inspect project, and just to remind you that, we are looking for collaboration and input, so you can contact me on my email or on my Twitter here. So thank you very much, and we should have some time for questions, I think.
Jack, thank you so much. Really excellent talk. Of course, you should be giving talks, otherwise you won't be invited. I will hijack a little bit of the time from the Q&A. Please do raise your hands if you have questions for Jack. So one quick disclaimer is that we will make the information available on the website, and you will receive an email if you signed up for this talk. So you will have all the details to contact Jack and to participate in his study. So, and I will start with a quick question for you. Well, actually, it's a big question, but you need to answer it quickly.
Okay.
So very, very impressive initiative. And I'm trying to fast forward history and work that you and Florian are doing and some other people. Let's say we create software, we create a fantastic system where we clearly label these bad studies. Can we have a repository of these, and where should it sit? Can this be marked in clinical trial registries? Because like you say, it's not just for systematic reviews. If Cochrane hosts it, what if the clinician looks at the study and they should not be trusting it? Back to the reverse your question, to the point that if the authors are we screwing up their careers? Are they going to become better in fabricating data? So what should we do? And one very final comment is, in 2 weeks, we're hosting Ivan Oransky from Retraction Watch. Maybe his platform might be the way forward. Interestingly, he's not going to give a talk, but he will lead a discussion. So this might be an opportunity for everything that we cannot discuss today. You have a chance in 2 weeks. So, Jack, please.
Let's see. There were a few questions and comments there, Lisa. I'll try and remember them all. So the first one, you said this idea of like posting these assessments somewhere in a repository. I mean, I agree that that's a good idea, right? And in fact, we're currently trying to apply for some funding to explore some of those options, actually. So, the idea being, if we did have this Inspect SR tool, could we make the assessments available somewhere so that people could sort of easily see any problems that have been identified? So I definitely agree that that's a good idea. And indeed, we are trying to pursue them. So we'll see what happens, I suppose. I think you also asked about implications for the researchers' careers. I don't know. I feel like that's a bit outside my wheelhouse, that one. So I'll try and give you a verdict on an individual study, whether I think it could possibly be genuine. What you do with that, I'm going to leave that to someone else, I think. I mean, if people have been fabricating data that could hurt people, I personally don't have too much sympathy for them. If we damage their career prospects, I don't feel too bad about that. But I'll mostly stick to trying to identify the problems, and then I'll leave it to someone else to really decide what we do with that, I think.
Thank you, Jack. So Nathan, great to see you. So the floor is yours. Go ahead. You're muted. Nathan, you're muted.
Yeah. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, again, thank you very much for a really great talk. What is not clear to me is what is the prevalence?
Yeah.
How common is this? is this equally prevalent across all fields of endeavor? Are there some fields of endeavor where you're seeing this more than in others? And if the research is a public good to develop generalizable knowledge which is going to affect public policy, clearly it is appropriate that there be consequences for people that are undermining this process and wasting resources and harming participants. And this is not a benign activity. This is a maleficent activity, and I think that it is appropriate to label it as such.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. So I think I'm finding it quite hard to work out this question of prevalence. Okay, that is a really difficult question to answer. I mean, we can try to get some sort of indirect estimates of this from different sources. So we have a few sort of surveys of researcher practice, surveys of like prevalence of questionable research practices, and we see sort of alarmingly high reported rates of data fabrication and falsification, particularly in sort of medicine and health. Another sort of potential source of information we could look to was, there's a recent exercise that was done by John Carlisle, and he looked at all of the trials that had been submitted to the journal Anesthesia, and he basically tried to assess them for problems. Okay, and he concluded that when he had access to the individual participant data underlying the study, he said that the way he phrased it was that 26% were critically flawed by false data. And we're all sort of talking in euphemisms, I think, sometimes, because nobody wants to get sued. But I think his wording was critically flawed by false data. All right. And I actually think his analyses, he presents some in the supplement, were pretty good. So he thought that 26% of the studies that were being submitted to that journal, when he had access to the IPD, he would say they were critically flawed by false data. It's unclear how many make it through to publication, all right? Most journals don't have that type of scrutiny going on. Most journals aren't conducting those types of checks. So it's really unclear how many studies are making it through a peer review process and, being published and subsequently included in peer reviews. So I wish I had a clearer answer for you about prevalence. We are relying on those quite indirect sources of information. I mean, as you said, on your other points, I mean, I do have some sympathy, really. So if people are fabricating data, knowing that it could influence patient care, again, I mean, I don't have a huge amount of sympathy if there's harm to their careers as a result. We do need to get it right, though, I suppose, right? We need to be pretty clear that we've got it right if we're going to sort of claim that somebody has fabricated data.
Thank you, Nathan, for your question, and thank you, Jack. Jack, you have an encouragement comment from Ian Tannock in the chat. So
great.
And while you're reading it, so David, please go ahead.
Yes, this takes me back to the question of alternative medicine, which is where my interest in misbehavior began before I realized how prevalent it was in the real world. For example, it's the case that there have been at least 5,000 RCTs of acupuncture. Cochrane and Nice frequently come up with meta-analyses which say that it works. But it's also very noticeable that 100% of the trials that originate in China, and also 100%, interestingly, of the trials that originate in Russia, are positive. And it's nothing like that number anywhere else, though they are unduly positive, one suspects it from everywhere. But it's pretty clear that you just get fired or put in jail in China if you criticized acupuncture, because it's business. At least this is my interpretation of it.
That's very interesting. Yeah, so I've not really looked at any of those. I've not really been involved in any investigations on alternative medicine trials, I don't think. But no, it's interesting. maybe there is a high prevalence there.
Well, yes, I mean, the health service spends money on acupuncture, and physiotherapists get some physiotherapists, the more flaky ones, get trained in it and practice it. So it's not irrelevant.
That's very interesting. Thank you.
David, thank you for your comment. Please raise your hand if you have a question for Jack, but we have quite a few comments or questions in the chat box. So Caroline asks what happened to Monticon, and would it make sense to do your testing of the using studies in Cochrane register of studies rather than the individual reviews, and would that then cover more areas of research and get you the idea of prevalence?
Mm-hmm.
And then she follows on to say, does your tool look at researcher allegiance, conflict of interest?
Okay, a few things there. So first of all, Monticone, don't know. I've not had any involvement with that at all. You could speak to the wonderful people at Cochrane Papas, some of whom are involved in the Inspect SR project, and I'm sure they'd be able to update you with what's happening with that. I think we've discussed a bit, Caroline, on Twitter, this idea of maybe it would be a good idea to look at individual trials in the Cochrane registry rather than looking at reviews. Possibly, I need to think about this a bit more. We're very interested in looking at, at the review level, what is the impact of applying these items to the conclusions of that Cochrane review? So how many trials would be removed from a particular meta-analysis, for example? How would that change the conclusions? How does that relate to the quality assessments in the trial? So I'd need to think a bit about whether or not we would lose that if we did move to looking at individual trials rather than looking at collections of trials in reviews, but I definitely need to think about that. And then research allegiance and conflict of interest. I mean, at the moment, no, there aren't any items on the list relating to that. I think you'll be aware that there is another tool in development looking specifically at conflict of interest in Cochrane reviews. I want to use the word tacit for the name of the tool, and I'll apologize if I've got that wrong, but I think that's right. But it's an interesting idea, should it be something that we should be looking at as a marker of other problems like research integrity issues? It's a good question. Maybe we should be adding some things like that to the list.
Yeah, what was it? I didn't realise there was yet another tool.
Tools for days.
Yeah, looking at conflict of interest that Cochrane is involved in.
I believe so. I think it's called Tacit. I think it's being piloted soon, I believe.
Any names of who's involved?
Not off the top of my head, but I can try and do some Googling as we talk.
Yeah, don't worry.
Okay.
I can Google. It's fine.
Okay.
So I would appreciate if you raise your hand and ask questions, because it's easier this way to communicate to everyone rather than typing into the chat. But yes, so there is a comment from Emma saying my problem with CRS is that it's just referencing. It doesn't link even to their ROB assessment that may have been done on the trial. And that goes back to the indexing question that I raised. How can we have this repository of red flagged things?
Right. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
So another comment to leading an excellent initiative. Definitely at Consilium will be following this closely, is very much of interest. And I think to me personally, and we already referred to this, it's very interesting to look at the past and not just to get the prevalence for the sake of a statistical number to say 3% of studies are fabricated. I think it really, really has implications, because more and more I come across clinicians, researchers, if it's published, it's taken for truth, especially if it's published in good journals. And we can't get away from this cultural mindset and this assumption that if it's out there, it's truth. Mm-hmm. And actually, it's eye-opening that this work is going, but I think my biggest wish from your work is how do we make publicity around it, and how do we raise enough money to actually work through the past, highlight. So how not to let the fabricated studies into further meta research,
Yeah.
but also how to not get it to clinical practice.
Yeah.
And I don't know how exactly it works, but I suspect that in developing countries, it also might be another cultural assumption. Oh, the studies coming out of the UK, the studies coming out of the US must be great quality. Let's use this in Congo. Let's use this in Jamaica. Let's use this elsewhere. And that's why this kind of cleaning this up would be fun.
I mean, I guess the ideal would be to stop this work from being published at all, right? So that would be the ideal, to make sure it never sees the light of day, it never gets published. And indeed, a lot of people say to me, why are you targeting this tool at the systematic review stage? That's too late. We should stop this stuff from being published, full stop. So there's never a question of it being included in a systematic review. And I have some sympathy for that, but I don't know. I mean, there's a couple of reasons why we've chosen to target the systematic review stage. I mean, first of all, right, I mean, as I said in the talk, systematic reviews include studies regardless of where they're published, really, right? I think if we try to target a tool at journals, to be used in the peer review stage, I think a lot of journals wouldn't use it, right? There's a lot of journals that don't adhere to good scientific principles, to good scientific standards. They wouldn't care, they wouldn't use it, they'd publish the studies anyway, and then they'd end up being included in systematic reviews. So that's one reason why I think it makes sense to sort of take stock at the systematic review stage. But I guess the other reason is that when you're doing the systematic review, you can compare the study against lots of other studies that have been done on the same topic. So you can see if it's unusual in any way. But I totally agree with you, everything we can do to try and stop these studies from influencing patient care is the goal.
Thank you, Jack. We're getting close to the end. So any questions, please raise your hand. So Lydia, please go ahead.
Thank you. Just quickly want to raise the issue why it's important maybe to stop it earlier at the stage of the study is for the patients, because what we have been doing in the past after we came across a particular case of it's a product used for cancer patients and published had several publications which were fabricated, but it was promoted by, the product was GC-Math. I can tell you the whole story if you want. And then patients were buying the product over the internet based on, so to say, peer-reviewed publications, which was the case. But then we found out that everything was fabricated. And then we fought for years and we could get some retractions of the papers. But in the end, the whole system was out there and patients believed the publication and still they are buying the product. You get that type of selling system from it's pure quackery, but it's very difficult to defend the evidence.
So there's a good question about how do you undo the damage, right? So how do you undo the damage? How do you undo the harm? That's a really hard question. I agree.
From the patient point of view.
Yeah. So more focus needs to be on, some sort of, I don't know, information education campaigns. But I don't know how effective that would be, right? If people really believe in this thing and they want it to work, are we effective when we tell them they're wrong? I don't know.
But it's also not immediate reflection on a particular study. I think it's about changing mindsets, changing the culture that, yes, such an outcome is a possibility. We live in the culture that if it's published, it's truth. And it's not questioning. We don't question science, and scientists don't question science. What do you expect from users and people out there who saw the paper? So I think it's a change of culture saying, yes, I'm seeing this information. Hopefully it's true. Let's see how it goes. And that is, I think it's very difficult emotional thing that just needs to eventually with generations to change, that this is the type of practice.
And I suppose with cultural change as well, there's another aspect to that, isn't there, which is targeting the research communities that are producing this fraudulent research and trying to promote better sort of research integrity practices there as well. Trying to make people realize that maybe this is harming people, or maybe just trying to put better sort of checks in place, right? So that it can't happen and people can't get away with it. That's best of all, isn't it? To stop people from being able to produce this fake stuff in the first place.
Any other comments or questions for Jack? Jack, one final question. What is the timeline? Because I understand this is NIHR published work. Funding is limited to this project. What are you hoping to achieve within the project in terms of timeline? And do you see any future of taking this forward?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, we're hoping to have a sort of draft tool by late summer of this year. That'll be our draft tool. But then we really want to spend some time testing it and refining it. So really we built into the grants a year of testing, really getting lots of people to try and use it in the production of systematic reviews to feed, but tell us it's not feasible, it takes too long, can you streamline this bit, if you haven't thought about this. So we've got a full year of testing built in, and alongside that, the idea is to sort of build and develop sort of training materials and to help people understand how to apply it as well, and to try and promote the dissemination of it. So all going well, the Inspect SR project should be complete in September 2024. So we're still got quite a lot of work to do. I mean, in terms of extensions, yes, certainly. So we've applied for some funding to think about how we could extend this for non-randomized studies as well. So the considerations for non-randomized studies are going to be quite different, because we can't rely on those checks based on compatibility with randomization. So we're hoping to extend this work to different study designs as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much